We've been talking about Russia. You have spent a tremendous amount of time negotiating with Russian officials. You spent time one-on-one with Vladimir Putin. What is he like to sit across from?
Well, he's very smart, very capable. He's always strategic. He's contained. He has an agenda, and you know that. His background is steeped in sort of how to achieve certain goals one way or another through psychology or through nefarious means. I think that what I found about him was, though, that he was ready to be serious and could compartmentalize in the way that you need to compartmentalize as a diplomat and in diplomacy. I mean, Ronald Reagan famously called the Soviet Union the evil empire, but then he sat down with Gorbachev and he came to an agreement on nuclear weapons. It was extraordinary. And I think that you have to realize that diplomacy requires that. I have never criticized the notion of somebody sitting down with somebody, providing you don't pretend there aren't differences after you've done it, providing that you hold people accountable to the real differences and you sit down for the purpose of working through those differences. So that's what we did very, very clearly. And in my long conversations with President Putin, I mean, I think I spent 4 or 5 hours with him, with other people there, as we negotiated on Syria or on other issues. I found him to be very practical and ready to try to deal and make things happen. The test was not what was said in the room. The test would always be, would they follow up on what they said they were going to do? Was there, in fact, an execution on what the agreement was? Obviously, in some cases there was. In other cases, there wasn't. Minsk, for instance, and the situation with Ukraine, no. With respect to Syria, where there were challenges. But on the other hand, there were things they did with respect to Syria. They cooperated with us in moving the chemical weapons that were declared out of the country. They cooperated on the Iran nuclear agreement. They still believe the Iran nuclear agreement is a good agreement and should be kept. They cooperated on Paris. They cooperated on a number of other agreements, on the Ross Sea.
What President Trump says he's trying to do now is simply to improve relations.
Well, but why didn't he do it?
It's not a bad thing.
Well, what did he do? I mean, you know, you can't say you did something when you didn't do it. After I had a meeting, Foreign Minister Lavrov and I went out and defined exactly what we had agreed on. And we began to implement it. On a number of ceasefires, we actually were able to hold them for a matter of weeks, perhaps even months in a couple of occasions. And people got food as a result of that. Lives were saved as a result of that. There's nothing you can show whatsoever that came out of this big summit other than a bunch of walkbacks and, frankly, more chaos over the course of the last few days.
Is it appropriate for two leaders, Vladimir Putin, President Trump, to meet one-on-one for about 2 hours with no other aides in the room? Is that something that you've seen before?
Well, certainly leaders have met on many an occasion for a brief period of time or for some period of time alone in order to work something out, but they almost immediately share what was worked out with people, with their team. I think in the case of President Trump, there are much more serious problems associated with his having that kind of meeting because his credibility, frankly, is number one, so non-existent.
You don't trust his retelling of what happened.
Number two, there are serious questions about his relationship with Russia and his relationship with Vladimir Putin. And I think until all of that is clarified, it is very difficult to take anything he says at face value.
Since you were in the administration when the meddling was discovered, when you say there are serious questions, do you know something in regard to President Trump and a relationship with Russia?
Well, I know the level of scrutiny that Russia puts on any high-profile guest of one kind or another. We had very specific procedures we had to follow with respect to what we would say and do in a hotel, or what your expectations were with respect to surveillance. And it's highly improbable that the Russians didn't have a similar scrutiny with respect to any of the visits, the many visits that Donald Trump made to Moscow. So I don't have specific, detailed information of any kind. I just know what the process is. I know what the experience is. I know what the reality is. And when you add all of those up and tie them to the president's behavior as he attacks NATO and attacks our allies and disrupts an alliance that has worked brilliantly for more than 70 years now and has created a value-oriented structure, and he starts attacking and moving away on that, then there's cause for a real concern.
You write in the book about knowing Bob Mueller for a long time. He's now a special counsel, but you were schoolmates.
Yeah, we were.
Years
we were
ago.
Indeed. Sure we were. We played soccer, hockey, and lacrosse together for a number of years. And we were classmates. He went on to a different college. We played against each other a little bit. But he's a extremely capable and very dedicated American patriot. I mean, he cares about the country, and he's a Marine for life, with a distinguished service record. And I have total confidence in his ability to uphold our Constitution and to do the job to the best of his ability. And I write a little bit about the early days at our school that we went to. But really what the book is about is the journey, the whole journey from school, early years, as a young American growing up in the greatest generation's shadow and watching and learning from afar as I traveled with a diplomat father abroad. So how is America viewed in the world, and what is our role in the world, and what is the difference we make to people's lives in the world? And living that life through many experiences, including the 28 years in the United States Senate, and then chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and then Secretary of State. I hope in the book I show, just by the experience of that journey, how we can rescue America from where we are today, by making our democracy work, by going back to a Senate where people respected each other, by having bipartisanship. John McCain, I write a lot about John McCain and my journey in reaching back to Vietnam, because that story is a story of keeping faith with soldiers. It's a story of keeping faith with the American people, but it's also a story of two guys who had a different point of view about a major event in American history, who found a way to come together. So a POW and a protester found a way to be able to make the system work and to work together and find common ground. In that sense, again and again, and I think in this book, I show ways in which we can not just talk about our democracy, but actually uphold it and make it work.
But it's not necessarily a political book. It's a memoir.
That's a personal book.
And you've had a lot of life. I mean, you could write books, as you said, about any
I hope
chapter.
I have a lot
you
more. I'm
experience.
not finished, but it's up to date.
But what made you write this now?
Well, I think what made me write it now is what's happening in the country, and the notion that my journey, I believe, is relevant to how we try to fix our country. How, you don't just speak out, which I did quite forcefully, but you work to implement our democracy by reaching out across the aisle, by building relationships, by believing in the better angels of American value system. And I think John McCain did that. I did that. Others have done that. But right now, we have a culture divide that has been accentuated by political so-called leaders. And what they're doing is they're operating in a factless world. America has been built on a democracy which is dependent on facts and dependent on truth. And my book, I think, is a display of the ways in which you challenge those who would try to tear it apart and not deal with facts, and how you, in fact, can hold the system accountable and get back to the fact-based democracy we rely on.
The title of your book comes from one of the lines you've actually written.
Yeah.
You said, "When I came home from Vietnam, I lived with the gratitude that every day was extra." Why did you pick that as the title?
Well, because I think it's characterized my life, for one thing, and number two, I think that everybody ought to try to, as I say at the end of the book, every day is extra is not a philosophy just for people who went to Vietnam. I think it's a philosophy for everybody. We are blessed in the United States of America. We live in the freest, most extraordinary society on the base of the earth. We have the most remarkable freedom to go out and create things, do things, build things. I think everybody owes the democracy we live in this notion that every day is extra and we're going to work to make it work. We haven't been doing that. In the last election, only 54.2% of Americans eligible to vote exercised that vote. That's the story of where we are today. At the time when I ran in 2004 with President Bush, it was 60.3%, I believe, that turned out. When Barack Obama was elected 4 years later, it was 62 point some percent. So that difference can be the difference in where your country finds itself and in what policies you face. So to me, every day is extra is something that, and it also, you know, it applies to your kids. It applies to your family. It applies to every choice you make in life. Live it with gusto. Live it with optimism and a sense of the possibilities.
You grew up in, you know, it's funny because whenever I talk about having covered you and traveled with you, Kerry was peripatetic. He was always on the move. And in some ways, in reading your story about the early part of your life, it's similar. You were always in motion. You moved around a lot, son of a diplomat.
Well, you're carrying a boy, and if you asked my mother if she was still alive, she'd tell you that from the moment I was there, I was moving.
And but it's continued. And
well, because I believe in seizing the day. I love it. I have a lot of energy, but I know how to veg. I can sit on the couch and watch TV for hours, and I can, you know, but I enjoy that too. The point is, grab it all, enjoy life, and I think that you have to get things done. The window in which, when I became Secretary of State, I write about this in the book, about that sense of, okay, here's this incredible job, I think perhaps the best job in government. And I have 4 years within which, unless I screw up, the president fires me, to try to get things done. And I look at the world, I look at things that are happening, Margaret. This is a dangerous time. This is a really dangerous time. That's what concerns me about what's happening with our president. He doesn't talk about the real challenges we face. 2 billion young people between the ages of 15 and 24 who need jobs and need a future. In too many countries, they don't have it. We're tearing things apart, not trying to push and bring Europe and bring Russia and China to the task of dealing with that. There are 1.8 billion kids, 15 years old or younger. Almost 350 million of them will not go to school. That's not a problem for people over there. That's our problem too, in an age of terrorism and instant movement of information and everybody with a smartphone. We need leadership that is dealing with the realities of the challenges that we face on this planet. Climate change, as an example. I'm looking at a world, I've got grandkids, you see the toys over there. Mm-hmm. In their lifetime, this planet on its current course is going to heat up to 4 degrees centigrade, not be held to the 2 degrees centigrade that we targeted in Paris. Donald Trump pulls out of Paris, but the American people remain committed to finding a way to try to meet it. And happily, 80% of the American people find themselves in 38 states which already have programs in place that could yet meet it. But that's not moving fast enough to deal with a 4-degree temperature increase. So for farmers, for insurance companies, for builders, for almost every walk of life, this is a real challenge for America, and our president denies the existence of that challenge.
And you write that's one of the things that worries you most, that he won't do.
Well, the last chapter of my book is called Protecting the Planet. It's dedicated to this notion. But I also write that I'm optimistic about the possibilities of the future. Why? Because we have solutions to all of these things. As President Kennedy said, all the problems we face are human created, they're human solvable. And so it's really a function of leadership and of choices that we make as a democracy and what we're going to do to try to meet those choices.
You mentioned President Kennedy, and you've had some extraordinary experiences in your life, but you talk
A little
about
like Forrest Gump showing up in weird places.
Zelig, Forrest Gump, one of those characters, and you actually met President Kennedy when you were in college, and that connection really.
I was about to go to college. I was in
about
between high school and college. I was working for Ted Kennedy for the summer in this huge Donnybrook of a political confrontation in Massachusetts, where the McCormick family was taking on the Kennedy family, and the Lodge family was involved. It was really quite something.
And you went out, we saw pictures of you sailing.
Yeah, I was
with the
very lucky.
president.
I was invited down for a weekend to Rhode Island, where the president was staying, to watch the America's Cup races and get some time off. And I totally serendipitously got to go sailing with him and sit around and sort of take in the conversation about the world and about politics, and it's been fascinating.
And you write that the night of his assassination was what made you decide you wanted to spend a career in public service.
I was very, very impacted, as we all were. I mean, I remember it just rocked. I was a sophomore at Yale, and I was on the soccer team. We were playing Harvard. We were in the middle of the Harvard game. And this ripple went through the crowd saying that the president had been shot. And as I write in the book that I really didn't remember who won the game or if we finished it. But it had a profound impact on everybody, and I spent the entire weekend, all of us did, we just were riveted to television, watching the live assassination by Jack Ruby of Lee Harvey Oswald, and the incredible, iconic moments of the caisson being, walked through the streets, and of John Kennedy Jr. saluting. It was amazing. It was an incredible time. And I write a lot in the book. I mean, the book is not just a memoir about me. It's a journey through the times, the end of World War II, which my mother and father were both very much wrapped up in various ways, and then the Cold War, and the journey to a occupied Berlin, where you had French, British, and American sectors, and an East sector, Soviet sector, which I bicycled into against my father's best thoughts. But the book is a journey. It's America's journey. It's the journey we all went through, where Vietnam tore the country apart. And I write very candidly about that period and what happened with that. And I write very candidly about how John McCain and I had differences and how we found each other's common ground on an airplane flying to Kuwait.
You said that was one of the most consequential conversations of your entire career in Congress.
Absolutely.
Why?
Well, because it resulted in this partnership, which sometimes had tensions, but which got things done. I mean, John McCain and I together tried to figure out, how do we make peace in America? How do we get America to be at peace with itself over Vietnam? And there was this Newsweek magazine with a front page cover. Are they still alive? And there were people, prisoners of war, on the front of a cover. And this is in, 1989 or 90 or somewhere, wherever it was, somewhere around there. And what we realized was that if we were going to move forward, both at home and in terms of the relationship, which could be important to the future of our relationships in the region, we needed to answer the questions of POW MIA. And so we were part of a select committee to do that. And today, what I write about in the book is that Americans don't know this. There are still American military personnel on the ground in Vietnam, digging up grave sites or potential grave sites, looking for the remains of American soldiers. And over 700 families, from the moment John and I began to work, and we put this together with the committee, with everybody's help and consent, we have now brought that closure to more than 700 families in the United States of America, where remains have been returned. I think it's a great story. No country in all of human warfare ever has been as accountable as the United States has for our missing and lost.
That war changed the trajectory of your life, but what you're describing is also you helping to shape the trajectory of that country in the later career you had. I remember walking through Hanoi with you.
Yeah, we were there on that trip.
And yeah, and you shut down the center of Hanoi because the crowds were gathering to watch you just talk to me. And it was tremendous to see that as someone who was there fighting in one point of his life, you came back almost as a celebrity to people who were warm
John
in the
McCain
reception
and
of
I
you.
are both pretty well known in Vietnam, obviously. I mean, there's a statue of John in the lake where they pulled him out of the lake. What I think John and I would both say to you about that is that we were privileged to be in a position to try to heal our country's wounds, to try to bring closure, to try to move a major international relationship to a new and better place. And I think to set an example for how people from different parties, from different wings of their parties, could come together and put the interests of our nation and the institution we worked in, the United States Senate, front and center. I'm proud of that. I think John's proud of that. I know he is. I had a chance to visit with him a month or so ago.
How is he doing?
He's in a fight, obviously, but he's a incredibly courageous and strong individual. He's got the great support of his family and Cindy, and he's taking it day by day. But he's a very special patriot.
What do you think was Senator McCain's biggest, boldest political move?
I don't know. I can't pick there. I just don't know.
Because you say at one point you even considered, played with the idea at least, of
We sat
partnering
down,
with him
we
as
sat
a
down
running
and
mate.
talked. Well, one of his top aides approached one of my top aides and suggested that there might be some interest in that idea.
You tempted him to become
I
a
write
Democrat?
in the book, no, he didn't have to become a Democrat. But there were difficult issues to try to work out. But as I said in the book, we kind of flirted but didn't go on a date. About it.
It would have been an interesting campaign to watch. You also, in the book, write about, in a lot of detail, what you went through in Vietnam, what you experienced, losing friends, taking a life. Was that a hard period for you to write about?
No, it wasn't hard, though. I'd just as soon see Vietnam be put in its appropriate place in terms of history. But I thought it was important to be factual and to clarify for a lot of people what we were doing, what I did do, what did happen, in ways that weren't particularly clarified sufficiently back in 2004.
You mentioned some parallels between what you saw when you came back and became an activist and the kind of divisiveness that you're seeing now. You were reliving in the book that moment that really put you on the political radar when you came as a young activist and testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And you didn't almost miss it, but you were pretty late that day. You showed up late.
Well, I wasn't pretty late, but I was late. I was late, yeah. I was late because I got distracted over by the Supreme Court to try to prevent some veterans from getting arrested. But I showed up and learned, to my amazement, I had no idea I was the only witness. I thought I was one of several witnesses.
And then you go on years later to chair that same committee.
Yeah, that's an interesting twist of history and fate. But I want to come back to something you said, may I? You talked about the parallel between then and now, and I really want to say something about that because it's very relevant, and I write quite a bit about this in the book, about what choices there are available to us to make our democracy work more effectively and bring it back from the brink here. And make no mistake, it's on a brink right now. The reality is that back in 1971, the war had divided America in remarkable ways. I mean, father, son, brothers, people were just on different sides. And the draft split people apart and put terrible choices in front of people. And then you had Richard Nixon, who engaged in criminal behavior. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, engaged in Spiro Agnew, engaged in criminal behavior and resigned. You had violence in our streets in many different places. You had Martin Luther King killed. You had Medgar Evers killed. You had Bobby Kennedy killed. Jack Kennedy had been killed a few years earlier. You had the Black Panthers. You had pipe bombs. You had riots in the streets, fires. I mean, this was a difficult period in America. You had a country that was racially extremely divided. You had a draft which was racially distorting the representation of who was fighting in Vietnam. I mean, all these overtones of what was going on, and a huge cultural transformation. Just follow the music of that period. And I write a little bit about that in the book. I mean, you know, there was the move from Elvis Presley and the crooners of the 50s to, you know, what we wound up with Bob Dylan going electric, and the Stones and the Beatles and the Grateful Dead, and run the list of it. The music is its own part of that journey. And I think so the bottom line, there was this incredible cultural, I guess, revolution taking place.
Is that what you see happening now?
I think there's a remarkable, the similarity is not in the Cultural Revolution, but in the cultural divide that is being exploited, that is in fact limiting, if not diminishing, the capacity of our institutions to work.
You think President Trump is doing what Nixon did? The
move away from the factless, the move to a factless political world, the move to distortion, to outright lying, the move to the racial divisions that are being exploited very, very fundamentally. What took place in Charlottesville, the immigration policy, the appeal to people's xenophobic instincts and other things, rather than legitimate, real ways to try to solve these problems and make America whole again and make America strong again. These are the things that I think a lot of people see great similarities to that earlier division in the country.
What's powering that divide now?
Well, I think it's being powered by illegitimacy of leadership. I think it's being powered by a Congress in the current majority that will not hold their own leader accountable. I mean, just what happened yesterday is extraordinary to me. I'm sorry, let me just reframe that, because I know just what happened earlier with respect to the president's revisionism, with respect to what he said in Moscow and Helsinki. The willingness of people in Congress to just adopt a totally transparent lie is going to do great injury to our democracy. We have to get back to facts and truth. And the way you do that is by being active politically and electing people who are going to hold the system responsible. It's the only way to do it. All the lamentations on TV, all the hand-wringing, all the tweets, none of that is going to pull America back from where it is. What will pull us back is hard political activism and work to elect leaders who are prepared to restore what makes our democracy strong, which is adherence to truth and adherence to American values.
Are you going to be hitting the campaign trail?
I'm going to hit the campaign trail for the Congress, you bet I am. I think that's the most important work we can do right now, is trying to elect people on a national basis and restore the leadership that the country needs.
But one of the things that people bring up these days is they're not really sure what the parties stand for, and they include Democrats very much in that. I mean, how do you define what Democrats stand for these days?
I think each Democratic candidate is going to define it as they go out and speak to people in their districts. And out of that, I believe, will come the future consensus that's necessary to take a party as a whole to a better place.
But it's a party in crisis.
Well, I'll probably get smacked for this, but you know, what I learned running for president is that you don't have a party per se where you have adherence to a strict platform, et cetera. You have an amalgamation. You have a group of people who call themselves Democrats, but they speak with different nuances and different approaches to various aspects of political choices in life. You get a party coordinated and I think focused in a genuine platform or agenda once you have a nominee. And I learned that when I became the nominee, and I think it's true historically. As I look back, it's just the way it works.
Before you even got to the point of running for president, though, I mean, you write in the book about starting a political career and being kind of viewed as this upstart who was trying to jump the line
Well, I
in the
was an
Democratic
upstart,
Party.
and I did. I mean, I write about it in the book. I'm pretty candid about my own failings in that regard. I think I came at it.
But you were coming at the Democratic Party's liberal base, and you were challenging that. I mean, do you see people like yourself now?
I don't see enough of them, no.
You don't?
Not enough. There are people like it, though. Yeah, I mean, in New York, in the congressional race, the young woman who won that race.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
I think there are a number of people around who are ready to go out and do the hard work. There are a lot of great candidates out there, by the way, and in the course of September and October, I'm going to try and be out there as helping as many as I can. One of my folks who from the State Department, Tom Malinowski, who was Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, is running in New Jersey in the district, and he's going to be terrific, and I hope he can win, and I'll be campaigning for him and for others. So there are a lot of folks we need to go out and help, and I think that's going to begin to clarify for people where the party is coming from and what its sense of direction and agenda is.
Are you going to run in 2020?
I am exclusively focused on what I just said.
That's not denial. That's not saying you're not going to run.
I'm not thinking about it right now. I'm really not thinking about it. I am focused. You know what, Margaret? Everybody who tries to take questions about 2020 right now or pose questions about 2020 right now is doing a disservice. That's not the fight.
But I hear the passion in your voice
It's totally,
here.
because I am passionate about these issues. Yes, I'm not, I mean, look at what I've been doing for the last 2 years. I've never retreated or retired or gone to a place where I haven't been speaking out on these things. I've been speaking out and working internationally. I've been working on climate change. I'm working on trying to move a number of countries away from coal. I'm doing a number of things. But talking about 2020 right now is a total distraction and waste of time. What we need to do is focus on 2018. We need to win back the confidence of the country to move in a better direction and to do it in sensible ways. And I think that will begin to articulate where things go or don't go as you head into 2020.
Well, I'm going to ask you that same question sometime after November. But
if you catch me.
if I catch you. You mentioned running in 2004, and you write a lot about it, and in some detail you hadn't actually made public before, some of the difficulties along the way.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I've written a lot of I've never written about the 04 race. I've never said anything much about it.
Why?
Well, because it's history, and I didn't want to sound sour grapes. I didn't want to, raise what ifs or this or that. I just didn't think it was appropriate. But in writing a memoir, it is appropriate to share things that really happened. I mean, we talk about what happened in Ohio. People who were trying to vote, who had to wait unbelievable hours, only in the Democratic lines. How is it that in the United States of America, two brothers who are chairmen of a presidential candidate's campaign can own voting machines, and you expect people to believe in the integrity of the system? There are things like that that need to be fixed and dealt with, but I didn't want to do it, whatever number of years ago, because I just think it wouldn't be viewed right.
You think
and I'm not doing it now. All I'm doing is saying these are the problems that we faced. These are the kinds of things that you've got to address to have a system that works so people can have real confidence in it.
You made the decision not to challenge that election in Ohio back in 2004. You came up 118,000 votes short, but you just suggested there might have been election tampering. Do you believe that?
No, I didn't suggest what
Well, you were talking about the voting machines.
What I said was there were long lines by Democratic precinct where they were trying to vote and not where the Republicans were trying to vote. We had to go to court to get voting extended so people in certain places were able to vote. We had certain voting machines taken out of precincts during the day. These were the things that I had to evaluate. I am not alleging, and never have, one thing or another specifically about it. I've said there were sufficient reasons to think, well, maybe a challenge is an option here. And there were people talking about it, and people who were mad at me that we didn't do that. But as I write in the book, after describing it pretty directly, I thought the better thing to do was to move on, to concede, to keep America from having to go through a lawsuit over its election at a time that we were at war and when there were very clear realities about where it was going to wind up in that kind of a lawsuit. We would have lost because we would have had the exact same outcome that Al Gore had 4 years earlier. So I didn't want to waste the country's time or my time in what I think would have been completely taken as a personal and venal effort by me to, take care of myself, not take care of the country.
Do you regret not fighting back harder against the Swift boat attack ads? I mean, that's actually become a political term now.
Yeah, I do regret that, and I say this in the book, I'm very clear, and I take responsibility for it. It's my ultimate decision. I'm responsible for it not having happened. But yes, I believe it was vital, particularly in the last days of the campaign, to be addressing advertisements that were such a grotesque distortion of the reality of what happened in the rivers of Vietnam.
And you regret picking John Edwards as your vice presidential candidate? You at least highlight in the book some questions.
Well, what I
he had a
say in the
troubled
book, well, I write in the
performance.
book, well, I think it was a troubled performance, and I say that in the book, yes.
What do you mean by that?
I think that if you measure, and I write in the book about the qualities that you're looking for when you choose a vice president, and I think when you articulate those qualities and then you measure what took place against the qualities that I very much lay out there that you're looking for, it didn't measure up. It wasn't what we had hoped for. So there was some disappointment in that. And I think, and I write about very clearly, and I think it's better for it to come out in the context of the clarity with which I try to write it, where words are very precise and where I describe it as carefully as possible. So if you want to learn more about that, you got to go buy the book.
Ever the diplomat. I want to ask you about another key relationship. Barack Obama. It was and you write about this, it was at your nominating convention in 2004 that it really put him on the map. You decided on him to be the main speaker.
Well, he put him on the map. I selected him to give a speech, but he gave the speech.
But when he won, he was inaugurated and he gave you a note that said, "I'm here because of you."
Yeah, it was very generous and I mean, a very meaningful note, but I also say, I didn't believe that. I mean, he was there because he was an amazingly skilled communicator and ran a superb campaign. So there's no pretense in any of that, but I write about it because it was very generous of him. It was a very nice thing for him to do. I was impressed by him, as I write, when I first saw him. We met in Chicago at an event.
You mentioned his big smile.
Yeah, he has one of the most winning smiles I've ever seen in politics. Yes.
But when you ended up years later, you went and worked for him as his top diplomat, as Secretary of State, and you write in depth about some of the weighty issues that you dealt with at the time, and you make clear you had some disagreements with him, particularly on Syria.
Well, I write about the choices we faced on Syria. I don't think we had a difference. We did have a difference.
You say you failed to convince President Obama to take risks. Specifically, you said, "I never succeeded in persuading him to give me the tool I wanted most, greater leverage."
Correct.
What do you mean?
Well, from the moment I was nominated and asked, what about Syria, I said, we have to change Assad's calculation. And throughout the 4 years I was Secretary of State, and privileged to be so, I always raised the issue in the meetings we had about how we needed to change that calculation. I particularly believed that after Assad had been violating ceasefires, which the Russians had said he was going to live up to, and he had said originally he'd lead up to, and then they'd claimed something had broken it that hadn't broken it, it was clear he needed to be taught a lesson. He needed to know that we were going to hold him accountable if the Russians weren't. And I raised that directly with the Russians, and I put several ideas on the table in the context of the administration discussions. The president was not persuaded by my argument. I believed that we had several options we could have done at very low risk to be able to make it clear to Assad that when we had a ceasefire and when he said he was going to live by it, he had to live by it. And I thought we should have done that. The president had a different point of view about what the risks were or where that might have gone.
Was he too
and
risk-averse?
As I say in the book, and I'm very clear about this, my job and the job of anybody in a cabinet is to put an idea in front of the president, to argue the idea. The president is the decider. And there is no clarity by which I can say to you, I was 100% right, or the president was 100% wrong, or vice versa. Those are the judgments that are made by a president. That's why you never heard me or saw me in a public discussion during the course of our time when we were serving, because I thought that was entirely and wholly inappropriate. But there was, I think, as you write a memoir, you have an obligation to try to describe what were the decisions we were trying to make and what were the variables in those decisions.
But do you think he was too risk-averse?
No, not. Are you kidding?
In Syria?
No, I think he had an attitude about Syria and a judgment about Syria. And he had a feeling about where that might take him if he made some of the decisions that I and others proffered. But on the other hand, any president who, with the experience of Jimmy Carter in 1980 in Desert One, where his presidency probably was lost in the failure of that mission to rescue people, captives, our embassy captives in Iran, that demonstrated the risk of making a decision. The President of the United States, President Obama, made an extraordinarily courageous decision, putting his presidency at risk, to send helicopters into Abbottabad, Pakistan, without informing the Pakistanis, with a very small coterie of people in the administration knowing about it.
You're talking about bin Laden now.
Bin Laden, to go after Osama bin Laden and to successfully eliminate him.
But on Syria,
one is reminded of how dangerous that was, because that helicopter had an accident going into that compound, and the helicopter was left behind. If that had failed, if Osama bin Laden hadn't been there, if our soldiers had been killed or captured or something bad had happened, then you'd have seen a presidency in great distress. He took that risk. He took it several other times after that. I was privileged to be part of a number of efforts where they tried to make a rescue mission, and the rescue mission went forward, but we didn't find the people we were looking for. Those are risky things for a president of the United States. He made the decision to, obviously, to bomb at one point with respect to the chemical weapons events that had taken place in Syria. He never retracted that decision, and there's a big debate in America about why he went to Congress, and we can have that argument. But the fact is...
Well, you write about this in detail. It's an entire chapter in the book. Because you, to be very frank, were hung out to dry here, because you went on television.
I don't say I was
No, that's my
dry,
characterization.
You're characterizing
I know that. I'm characterizing your retelling, though, where you went out and you made this prosecutorial, very careful argument about the chemical weapons attacks.
And what I write about is that the way the events played out, and I'm confident President Obama will probably write about this too, we paid a price for the way it played out without the red line being enforced by the bombing. But we got the chemical weapons out, which was the objective.
Even though there have been chemical weapons attacks since then.
Yes, because we knew there were precursor chemicals, and we knew that there was chlorine, which when mixed, they still had ability. Those aren't declared. That's just the vagary of the system by which they measure.
But there have been sarin gas attacks since then, so
yes, that is
under the Trump administration.
It's absolutely correct. And I supported President Trump's response to those partially. I supported the use of force, but I don't support just a one-off where you drop a few bombs and there's no follow-up diplomacy and no additional effort to try to use the leverage you get out of doing that. I thought that the president should have done that. President Trump should have done that. And
you thought President Obama should have done that,
yes,
too.
Yes, that's correct.
And you said virtually every advisor in the room in these national security meetings was with you in thinking the president should have used some leverage to back up his red line.
I don't think I said that. There were several people in those discussions. I never said that. There were several people in those discussions who did not agree that we should have used force.
The chief of
There
staff.
were people who did believe that we should, a few people, and the argument never carried the day, period. That's the end of it.
You say in the book, you were never sure if the president changed course or was never completely sold on going ahead with Congress in the first place. You were sent around the world to rally support for other countries to stand with the United States, to say that this red line on use of chemical weapons needed to be enforced. How difficult was that for you, given that the president blinked? He decided not to go through with those military strikes.
Well, that's not entirely accurate, what you're saying, that he decided not to go through. Congress was clearly not going to give him the authority that he wanted.
But he was going to take those strikes before he
was,
decided to go to
and that's
Congress.
what many people advocated, that you should just take them and do them. But people forget that 2 days before that, in the Parliament in England, that Prime Minister David Cameron went to the Parliament for a vote, and he lost. So his democracy had a vote. Those who were clamoring for a vote in the United States, many of them, were crying wolf, because they would have been just as happy if the president had done it and didn't. But they said, you got to have authority, because they opposed anything President Obama did. So it was in that context also the president had to think about it. But the Congress, with the vote in the Foreign Relations Committee, which was 10-7, made it clear we were not going to get the votes. And it's subsequent to that. So during that period that I worked the agreement with Sergei Lavrov, where we got the weapons out of the country. So it became mooted as a consequence of that.
But you thought that the president could have gone ahead with those strikes. You were
I did.
in the book, you
Yes,
write
I
about
did.
being
I did.
surprised when he called you and said, I'm going to go to Congress.
I was surprised. I thought we were going to go forward. I thought that weekend was the weekend. I expected the phone call to be telling me that he decided we were striking that night or whatever was going to happen. And it wasn't. My job was to then affect the president's policy, and I did the best I could in going to Congress and arguing the case. But I do write that we paid a price for that. There's no question about that. We paid a price. And all the explanations and everything else doesn't change the perception. And perceptions sometimes are very telling in diplomacy and politics.
You paid a price. You mean the red line moment has come to, for many critics of President Obama, define his foreign policy and define it as weak, as not backing up a threat.
For many people, that's exactly what I ran into. And I ran into that in the Middle East. It was something that I had to push back against for a long period of time. And that's why I say perceptions. But perceptions matter, obviously, in everything. But I don't think it's fair in terms of the president, quote, being weak, because the president took a lot of very tough positions and did a lot of things that evidenced strength and that showed a president who had a very clear moral compass as well as a very clear set of values and principles by which he knew he could protect our country.
But I'm pressing you on this because you write in the book about thinking even now about what you call the open wounds in Syria, that you think almost every day.
Well, the open wound of Syria is that maybe 500,000 people have now died. It was about 100,000 back in 2013 when the chemical weapons attack took place. It has been an ongoing atrocity, a violation of every sense of propriety, of human rights, of diplomatic rectitude. I mean, you run the list of things that are at stake in Syria. It is a sad history for the international community, not just for the United States. It is the failure of the global community to hold a tyrant, a war criminal, accountable for his behavior, and to have come together and tried to end a war. What I'm proud of is that we continually tried. We never stopped trying, even when it was tough, even when it looked bleak.
You never stopped trying.
We never stopped trying. The president gave me the permission and encouraged me to not, and he never said, stop trying, I want you to.
And you took some heat for not stopping trying.
Yeah, we took heat right up into the end, but that's okay by me. That's fine. I thought there were ways to do things, and I write about it in the book. I'm very clear about it. I still believe there were ways to do things, and I think we could have made ultimately a difference. Now, some people will disagree with me on that, but the travesty of Syria is that it was obvious what was going to be happening and what ultimately did happen to Europe. As more and more of these refugees, as Turkey would turn the dial a little bit and flow people in, and it was undoing the politics of the region. We're paying the price for the politics of Europe today as a consequence of the unwillingness to do some of those things earlier, in my judgment. And I think that with Daesh and ISIL, when ISIL came on the scene, I thought we should have tried to eliminate ISIL as fast as possible, as fast as we had the capacity to, because it struck me that every day that ISIL went on, they were ripping apart the fabric of the region. They were making the politics far more complicated.
You mean a more aggressive use of force?
I think that we should have, I offered again a number of options for how I thought we could have perhaps changed that dynamic faster, sooner. And I asked and worked at questions in the course of the national security, the principals meetings and meetings that we had to try to sort of divine that policy. We worked hard at trying to find things, but it was a never-ending debate. It was a debate where there were just very strongly held different points of view. Some of them in the Pentagon, where there was a reluctance to do certain things. So it was not cut and dry. It was not simple. But the bottom line is, the region has paid a terrible price. Europe has paid a terrible price. Syria has paid perhaps, I don't know, 50-year, 100, I don't know how long it's going to take, or if Syria can be put back together. Assad is in the driver's seat today because of what Russia and Iran, Hezbollah have done. But I think it's very important to understand something, and I don't see any political activity sufficient to respect this fact. And the fact is, there will be no ultimate solution to how you're going to resolve Syria without Russia and Iran being involved in that discussion. And I see nothing happening diplomatically that owns up to that. So we have an open wound. Yes, a global, an international community owned open wound.
In those days, those very intense days when you were working diplomatically to try to build support to stand with the U.S. if they were to go through with a strike, we were at that press conference in London. And
you asked the question. You asked the magic question. Is there anything that Assad could do? That was your question.
But it's a question you had been wondering about.
Sure, I've been talking about it with a number of people.
You were looking for a way to avoid the strike, having looked at the calculus that the vote wasn't going to be there in Congress.
At that point, it was clear that we weren't going to win the vote in Congress, sure. But
why did you say that day?
I said that because I believed that it was a Hail Mary thread of possibility for how we might be able to resolve it.
Why did you float the idea at that press conference in London? Was that a mistake?
A mistake. It turned out to be the way we solved a critical problem. It was done purposefully in order to put out there a notion without a formal proposal, just as an answer to your question, which came at the right moment. And within an hour, I had a call from Sergei Lavrov, who said, let's follow up on that. We're interested in seeing if we can make that happen. There'd been a dance going back and forth, and I write about that as to whether or not they could or couldn't do it, were interested in it or weren't interested in it. But after I said it publicly like that, they took that as the possible off-ramp. And it turned out to be the way to get it done.
And it was, you write in the book that you and the foreign minister of Russia had talked about this idea of could Assad hand over his chemical weapons?
Yes, we had. We talked about it on the phone. We talked about it in person. And President Putin and President Obama had talked about it.
But you didn't think it was possible, that it would work?
No, we said that publicly. But
well, you write in the book that Lavrov said, no, that wouldn't work.
We're covering ourselves.
Well, Vladimir Putin brought it up as an idea. Was this ultimately Putin's idea to hand over the chemical weapons?
It had been bounced back and forth. President Obama was talking about it. He was talking about it. Actually, Bibi Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, in a conversation I'd had maybe a month earlier, raised the question, wouldn't it be great if we could get the weapons out of there some way?
Without a strike.
Well, no, he didn't talk about a strike then. He just said, wouldn't it be great if we could figure out a way to get them out? So the idea had been germinating, percolating, and I decided then was the moment to try to put it out into the public ether to see whether or not something evolved.
But ultimately, because you believed that a strike, you thought a strike was necessary to enforce the president's red line. That was your thinking at the time. Do you regret that this is the diplomatic off-ramp that you ended up with, that ultimately what you strongly believe should have happened didn't?
No, what I regret is that there is that's such a incredibly powerful perception gained a foothold the way it did, that had an impact on people's judgment about what the president was willing to do or not do.
Not enforcing the red line.
Correct. That's regrettable. It's regrettable for everybody. But I don't regret putting the idea on the table. And I think it was a terrific outcome in the sense that we got all the declared weapons out of there. Now that created its own misunderstanding, because people don't know what the difference is between declared weapons and non-declared weapons.
Well, because there have been at least 2 large-scale chemical attacks.
Correct.
In the past few years.
Well, and during which time he's had an opportunity to reconstitute and gain a foothold, and there's been no further inspection and nothing else going on. So no surprise that people are, and that is why I supported President Trump's use of force on 2 occasions, which I believed needed to be accompanied by the appropriate diplomatic initiative to try to solve the problem of Syria.
You don't agree with President Trump on many things, so that's notable that you say that. I want to ask you a little bit about Iran. You spent a tremendous amount of time working to get this deal with Iran for them to freeze their nuclear program. And you write in your book, I was more confident in the merits of that deal than anything I'd ever worked on.
Correct.
Do you regret not taking that deal to Congress to put it in law to protect it from President Trump just exiting it with the stroke of a pen?
No, because Congress wouldn't have accepted it that way. It was very clear. Congress was run by the Republicans. The Republicans were opposed to this, and they were opposed to it as a matter of a lot of things. I mean, I'm not going to go into all of those now, but it was an automatic opposition, almost like it was to almost everything President Obama did. Remember that Mitch McConnell announced publicly that the purpose of the caucus, the Republican caucus in the United States Senate, was to make President Obama a one-term president. That was their purpose in life. And that is one of the bad things that has happened to American politics, that it's become purely destructive politically on one president or another for one reason or another, rather than a Senate and a House that want to work to get the business of our nation done in a bipartisan way. And that's a tragedy for all of us. And that's why these elections in 2018 are so important. We have to rescue our country from the grip of people who are unwilling to try to create bipartisanship and who are not under the thrall or fear of a right-wing, hardline group of people who are going to punish them with primaries or with something else. Our politics is broken. And my book is a story of one American journey through this democratic adventure and what has happened to it over the course of time. What makes it work? What doesn't make it work? What has torn it apart? What is the fix for what is happening today? And I hope people will read the book with that sort of mission, that they'll say, wow, you know, there is a way to make things work better. There was a time when our country could do things more effectively. There are ways to be able to solve these problems. And I think that's what's important today. Look, what I regret about the decision the president made on Iran has nothing to do with me. Yeah, I worked hard. That was my job. I regret it for America. I regret it for the world. I regret it because it is a dangerous decision, because it empowers the hardliners in Iran, because it makes it tougher for the leadership in Iran to ever deal with the United States or any other country, because it evidences a fundamental ignorance about Iran and the nature of their politics and where the world could have gone if we had kept that in place. Here's what they should have done. This agreement made it physically impossible for Iran to move to a more dangerous place over the course of the next
President
years.
Trump said it's the worst deal he's ever seen.
Yeah, but just saying that doesn't make it that. This is the toughest agreement in terms of inspection, accountability, what Iran was required to do with the greatest visibility for the longest period of time of any nuclear agreement on the planet. No country has had to do what Iran did in order to live up to this. And the truth is that with a limitation of enrichment to 3.67%, that's all they can enrich, to have a stockpile of only 300 kilograms, that's all they could have for the next 13 years. You cannot make a bomb. So why not say to the Iranians, you know what? I don't like what you're doing in Yemen. I don't like what you're doing with missiles. I don't like what you're doing with Israel. I don't like what you're doing with Hezbollah, which we all don't like. But I'm going to keep this agreement in place because it's better that you don't have a nuclear weapon while we are going to negotiate how we're going to fix those other things. And if you don't fix those other things, then I'm going to take this agreement away. That would have been a good negotiation. But to just walk away while Russia, China, France, Germany, and Britain are all trying to keep this agreement in place. Only the United States walked away, only Donald Trump. So I think that experts who understand, the Defense Department, his defense secretary thought he should keep it. The Secretary of State that he got rid of thought he should keep it. His intelligence people thought he should keep it. The fact is, this agreement is working.
And you
And
tried
now
to
it's working
save
without
this
the United
deal
States. Yes, I did.
behind the scenes.
Well, I tried.
And that really angered President Trump. You were calling other foreign ministers. You even spoke with Javad Zarif. He told
Well, at
me,
that point
the
in
Iranian
time,
foreign
the policy
minister.
of the United States was still to support that agreement.
But the president thought you were trying to undermine him.
No, I was trying to have the policy of the United States of America, which is part of the agreement, to continue and common sense to continue. And I will always speak out, always speak out. I didn't do anything. I didn't negotiate. I spoke out. And I will always exercise my right to speak out. That's one of the lessons I learned in Vietnam. When leaders are on the wrong track, people have to speak out and hold the system accountable. And you don't walk away from that. And you don't let, a tweet or some irresponsible statement by somebody who has no credibility intimidate you from exercising your right of speech in the United States of America.
But President Trump would say he was elected on a platform of exiting this deal, and he went out and attacked you personally because of the phone calls you were making.
I don't put any stock in that at all.
He said John Kerry never walked away from the table except to be in that bicycle race where he fell and broke his leg. That's it.
Well, first of all, there wasn't a race. Secondly, he doesn't know what he's talking about because I did walk away. I called Javad Zarif and said, I'm not coming from London. You may have been in London with us. Mm-hmm. When I did that, I said, I'm not coming. If you don't back off from this, I'm not there. I'm gone. And we almost walked away on 2 or 3 other occasions where we thought it was necessary. So he really, unfortunately, and I say this sadly, more often than not, he really just doesn't know what he's talking about. He makes things up. And he's making that up, as he has other things.
That was a pretty serious break.
Yeah, I mean, I broke my leg.
But it was
break your leg, it's serious.
Inch away from your artery. Pretty serious in the midst of your negotiations there.
Yeah,
you had to have been tempted. Didn't you want to say something at the time? Tweet back at him, at President Trump, when he attacks you?
I haven't yet. I don't think that just doesn't take you anywhere. It's not a very... I think America and our democracy are more thoughtful than dishonest tweets.
There's almost no mention in the book of one of the biggest foreign policy crises right now, and that's North Korea. Why?
Well, because you just can't fit everything in. I mean, there's no mention actually of a lot of things, and I think that...
Well, President Trump says this was just a problem that was left for him by you
President
and the administration.
Obama, well, look, and in the course he's going, it's going to be left to somebody else to be honest about it because he isn't being honest about it. The president has gotten nowhere fundamentally, except that we haven't had a missile shoot, we haven't had an explosion, but Kim Jong-un has his nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-un has his nuclear capacity. There has been no announcement whatsoever about inspections, about declarations, about access, about anything that is at the core of any kind of agreement with North Korea. And there are many, many people who believe that what Donald Trump did was give the leader of North Korea what he and his father and his grandfather always wanted, which was a meeting with the President of the United States of America.
Would you have ever
We
met
have
with
no
Kim Jong-un?
details, not without an understanding, and that's why we didn't meet. We didn't go do that because we specifically said we need a better understanding of exactly what you're prepared to do. And with the absence of that, we declined a number of initiatives. And we also, you know, we got China to ratchet up its sanctions on 2 different occasions. And President Obama said to President Trump, President-elect Trump, when he came to the White House, your biggest single challenge is going to be North Korea. So we weren't hiding anything, but we knew that China needed to ratchet up its sanctions, and we applauded. I applauded President Trump then going back, taking it to 2 more levels, because that was the kind of pressure that was necessary to get him to do something. Still more pressure has to be put in place, and guess what? Because of the current attitude, because of the current fallout from the summit, there's less pressure than there was previously in terms of the economic sanctions, less pressure from China, more flow of goods, et cetera.
President Trump sort of values this idea of flexibility and being unpredictable. Do you think President Trump's unpredictability is or can be an asset?
Well, it depends on what the specific situation is, what the negotiation is, what's at stake, and what kind of unpredictability you're demonstrating. There are occasions when an opponent, not knowing what you might do or where you're going to go is an advantage, sure. I think I would never say no to that. But unpredictability that destroys 70 years of a strongly defended message, such as NATO, or unpredictability with respect to what your policy is with respect to nuclear weapons or disarmament or whatever, or Russia, is not a good thing. There are certain times where unpredictability invites an overreach by a country. Unpredictability, for instance, the unpredictability that could come from whatever it is that President Trump said, we don't know what it is, in the privacy of the meeting with Putin. Who knows what kind of judgment Putin might make about what his next move could be somewhere. When the president attacks Montenegro, as he has in the last weeks, and does that mean that if something were to break out in Montenegro, the president isn't going to be there for them? Is that an invitation for Putin to say, well, he's not really part of NATO now? That kind of unpredictability is not good in international affairs because it creates the potential for mistakes. And the last thing you want to do is see a conflict over a mistake.
You don't take President Trump at his word that he confronted Vladimir Putin?
I have no idea what he said, but I don't believe, given his reaction in the press conference, he might have said, if he had, you know what he would have said at the press conference? Let me just tell you, I just had a very tough conversation with the president of Russia, and I think he knows exactly what I believe about this. And I stood up for the United States and made it clear that this cannot go on. That's a comment of a person who actually raised it and did something. But he didn't. He ran off to a convoluted set of responses about Hillary's server and about 30,000 emails, and nothing whatsoever publicly, which would have reassured the people of the world and the United States of America particularly.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the personal aspects in the book. And I think there's some things in here people can relate to. You talk about some of the toughest parts in your life, and you say you were filled with failure, a sense of failure, at the end of your first marriage.
Yeah, sure.
Is
Well,
that
it is a failure. Well, I mean, that's what people say. Oh, my marriage failed. I mean, that's what you say about it.
But it was painful for you. The way you write about it, you
Well,
say it was one of the
I
most
think
painful
for
events in
anybody
your
who's,
life.
boy, if you're in touch with your feelings and in touch with, sort of the humanity of it all, I can't see how it wouldn't be painful for people. Now, I write in the book that some people shed wives or husbands the way they take off a coat and they move on to the next and it doesn't seem to bother them. That's not me. I mean, I wasn't, and I don't think it's most people. Particularly with children, it is an upheaval. It's a tough process, and I hated it.
And you talk, and I think it's for someone who often is thought of in political terms or almost aloof. It's a very humanizing thing, though, that you write about.
Back when I had my prostate cancer and I had my prostate removed, I said I had my aloof gland taken out. So I thought I'd solved the problem back then. And when I ran for president, I think people changed their attitude about that. I think that was an old moniker. But I think that, I write about it honestly. I mean, I write about what it's like, how I felt. It's tough if you have an argument with somebody one morning and then you got to go out and campaign and put on a smile in the afternoon. That's what the challenge is.
And you were getting torn between cities, torn
and that's
between
very hard.
your
Well,
family
everybody
and
is.
career.
Let me tell you something. One day you guys should do a story. I mean, somebody should do a story on how tough it is for a lot of the members of Congress who are sleeping in their offices because they can't afford a second home, and so they're away from their kids and they miss events, and there's always a tug to be back home and to be with your constituents. There are huge pressures on people in public life. I think one of the things that might even change the way we're currently behaving is for the leaders of Congress to actually come together and say, how are we going to make this better? Another way we could make it better is get the money out of American politics. Stop the incessant money chase, which is part of the reason why people are away from their families, because they got to travel all over the nation to raise money in order to run for office. It's a crazy system, and it's hurting our democracy.
You also write, and I don't think you've ever spoken publicly about your wife Teresa's health issues, which happened when you were Secretary of State.
Well, Teresa had a very bad, big grand mal seizure, as they call it, and it just came out of nowhere. It came out of the blue. What we learned very quickly is that 50% of all seizures, doctors can't tell you where it came from or why. And for a lot of people, it's just a one-time happening. You have a seizure, and you never have another seizure in your life, although there are people who live with recurring seizures. So she had a grand mal seizure. It had an impact on her balance, a little bit of an impact early on her response time, et cetera. But she's doing extraordinarily well. She's still got a couple of health challenges that she's taking on, but she's doing great. And her mind and her attitude and her zest for life are fabulous. So we're very blessed.
So we don't see the two of you together very often, but she's doing well, you said.
Well, we're not in public that often, but we're together. And she's gone out to visit the grandkids for a few days, and that's her joy and passion.
You also talk, I think, to some extent, about your faith, and in the book, and you speak about how God can let bad things happen and let people suffer. You say, so many books have been written about why God would allow so much evil in a world he had total control over. None of them provides a completely convincing answer. The only answer in the end is faith. How do you think your faith has shaped you?
Well, I write about the journey quite considerably in the book, more than I thought I would. I mean, it just kind of began, and I went on about it because, I mean, it's been an interesting journey. I began as a kid who went through, my mother, the Protestant, raised the kids as Catholics because that's what my father was Catholic, and I went through First Communion and confirmation and so forth, and I was touched by it. I mean, I sort of felt very pious at times as a kid and would pray a fair amount. and I write about it and the circumstances, et cetera. And then, like a lot of people who become teenagers and go on in life, you kind of pull back a little. You may become more agnostic and questioning, and I went through every phase of questioning and so forth. And I think war, if you're in a war, it's hard. Some people find more faith, some people lose it. I find the inquiry absolutely intriguing. I mean, if I went back to college today, I think I'd probably want to sub-major or major in comparative religion and psychology and other things. And I think it's fascinating with respect to the world we live in today to understand the Islam and to understand the difference between Shia and Sunni and to understand Hindu and where everybody's coming from and what are there similarities between Abrahamic faiths, which are really quite considerable, and the scriptures. So I started reading and studying and thinking more and more. But look, who doesn't look up at the sky at night, at the universe, at the Milky Way? Who doesn't stop one day and say, who made these beautiful flowers, and why can I distinguish between beauty of one and a different kind, and why do I see beauty in people or not? Or why is something ugly? Where's that come from? Where'd the first dust come from, or the first gas that created the great explosion? We all go through these questions, and I went through a lot of them. And you read the papal encyclical, and you try to figure out what they're saying about suffering and salvific suffering and so forth. It's complicated, but it's worth the inquiry. And I find that if you accept that there is a God, and if God is omniscient and omnipotent, so forth, it is pretty hard to accept why Hawaii blows up and a bunch of people are killed, or why people shoot kids in a school or something. That's evil. That's easier to explain. But what are the things that you have to try to explain that are, quote, God-given, and why? And in the end, there is not a linear, rational answer to those kinds of things. That's sort of where I landed. You keep looking for the linear and the rational, but that's what faith is. And if you believe in God because there's no other explanation for where we are, and you get sort of down the next step, you make the leap of faith. And that's a quick explanation of a very complicated, convoluted, complicated, long-term challenge for everybody to figure out.
Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you for going through your life with us.
Some of it.
Some of it.